Thank you very much. I'm going to start out the session with a few comments, and then my associate, Don Huffman from Vinventions, is really going to take over the lion's share of the presentation. And we're hoping that what is such a simple concept of a closure to, secure your valued product, and for some reason it has so many complexities to it. And I'm hoping that it'll be revealed during the course of the presentation, and you can see the value there. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to mute my video so that I am not seen through the presentation or a distraction. And I'm going to do that now, make a few comments, and then Don will get started. And we'll have to do that with some glasses on. There we go. The Waterloo Container aligns ourselves with world-class partners. We are a distributor, not a manufacturer. So we rely on the expertise of these partners, to the nth degree. We've had a long-term relationship with our presenter today, Vinventions, Don Huffman, and kind of very frankly, Vinventions is probably one of our most innovative, by far, world-class vendors in the marketplace, certainly in the closure space. They have taken, they migrated what was known as a TCA-free plastic wine bottle closure to an amazing high-performance, TCA-free, sugarcane-based, eco-friendly, zero carbon footprint. I know there's a lot of buzzwords in there. Technical closure. And the other nice part about it is that same closure that you might be used to using now, we'd like to have you consider using one of the options that Don's going to share with us. And it works in your same equipment. Before I turn it over to Don, we're all creatures of habit. We are used to using what we use. We reorder what we use. In a lot of ways, Waterloo Container appreciates that. But we wanted to have you keep an open mind and really consider using this technical closure for all the reasons that Don will share with you kind of moving forward. Myself and my CSR team is here long after the presentation to help allow you to migrate from maybe a closure you're using now to a Vinventions closure. And, we'll be here, while you're using that closure to be any assistance that is really necessary along with our partner Vinventions. So now I turn it over to Don Huffman.
Well, good afternoon to you. It's still, it's only 11 o'clock here in the West Coast here in Napa. And I do appreciate being asked to speak with all of you today. And it's an intimate group. So by all means, if you have a question, put it in the chat. I'm very comfortable in Zoom. I do a number of calls, but also I'm involved in with the Napa County Office of Education. So we have during COVID, we've had the majority of our meetings take place on Zoom. So I'm very comfortable here. However, I'm most comfortable in the dirt. I grew up a row crop farmer. We converted everything to almonds over the last 7 or 8 years. Almonds in Northern California almonds in general get a bad rap for the volume of water that they consume. However, up in Northern California, I'll give you some insight. We have a clay basin that's about 3 feet underground. And so we have about 3.5 feet of topsoil and a clay basin. So it's kind of like our almond trees are sitting in a giant potted plant. And quite successful, very hardy, and almost minimize the amount of water they need. Having said that, however, they can't avoid frost. And so we lost about 98% of the almonds this year from Northern California due to frost. So it's very unusual for almond orchards to have frost protection devices because it's just very unusual. The crops in Northern California are The trees are relatively new, so there hasn't been a need for it, but I assure you that there's going to be some changes, I think, made. My other livelihood is I'm a proud, third generation farmer in Northern California. My father's parents were migrant workers that moved to California and established themselves here in Northern California during the Grapes of Wrath era. So I'm very proud of our heritage here. And winemaking has always been something that's been a part of it. So my grandmother used to make brandy, like many grandmothers, I suppose. My grandmother made fruit brandy with peaches and apricots sitting up on a fence post, burning through the heat and saturating into their brandy. I made my first wine in college. It was a kind of a rock gut Zinfandel made in the basement of our fraternity house, and made for a great sangria, but it didn't make for a great commercial grade Zen. Today, I'm uniquely suited to speak with you all today as a winemaker, commercial winemaker. Have my own small boutique winery in Suisun. See you soon in Suisun, we say, and it's in the AVA just west of Napa Valley by about 11 miles. We have estate Cabernet, Petit Verdot, and Pinot Noir. And then I make valley floor wine. Our winery is 500 feet above the valley floor. And so I also make a Tempranillo, Merlot, kind of the standard stuff. But anyway, I put my tools that we're going to talk about during this presentation to use quite often, even in a small setting like my winery. It made for a very curious scenario because as I speak to Gallo and the Wine Group and Trinchero and Hess Collection, and a number of these bigger accounts that have higher volumes, it's even more imperative that we have good controls on a small level, because if I lose a barrel of wine, I lose my entire production, right? So if I lose 1 barrel or 100 barrels, to me, it's got equal importance. So everything that we talk about is assuring that your wine is protected from maturation all the way through to finished bottle. So let's jump into this. Vinventions is, I've got to figure out my controls here. So who are we? Vinventions is a large holding company that is established really as Nomacork back in 1999, but today is a holding company for a number of brands, including Nomacork, Suber, Vintop, and so forth. But we have essentially our portfolio, it's about 75% Nomacork, and then the balance comes in with Screw Cap and Suber. So yeah, I said Screw Cap, which is kind of amazing to think about where we were 10 years ago. That's not something we'd ever say. It was kind of a bad thing to say if we were a part of Nomacork. But today we have evolved. Our company has evolved. We've always had a sustainability journey. In the early days, the first generation Nomacorks were really all about the sustainability of the wine and protecting. And so cork taint was a big deal. It still is today. There's still a fair percentage of that is still unfortunately involved in such a natural product, but that's where it came from. It's really focusing in on the prevention of TCA. And then it became highlighted in around 2000, 2006. It was really managing the carbon footprint and preventing spoilage. So the wine continues to be a part of innovation straight through. We introduced a green line in 2013, which uses biopolymers that come from sugarcane. So 2 acres of sugarcane can produce about 2 million corks twice a year. And those corks, if you've ever seen a synthetic cork or a plastic cork, whatever you guys feel comfortable calling it, today that cork is likely coming out of this green line. That's something that Waterloo sells. Is coming out of this green line and is likely have a zero carbon footprint because of the off gassing that comes from the consumption of carbon, basically from sugarcane itself. We initiated a private recycling program with Total Wine and More, and today that recycling program is in all the Total Wine stores across the U.S. and Canada. And so we have a complete circular economy going right now with our closures, because these corks can be recycled 100%. So there's not a single cork that we manufacture that cannot be recycled at some level. And, then we take a big focus on our sustainability practices, water conservation, solar panels, etc. But the big key here is preservation of the wine as well as the circular economy for the closures. Today, Vinventions, again, as I mentioned earlier, is really the house of 4 brands that are all performance related. So you've got Nomacork, which is 100% recyclable, both green and recycled raw materials. Suber is probably something you've not been exposed to before. It's a high-end extruded micro natural, so much like a micro agglomerate, except it doesn't have any polyurethane glue. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but it's the lack of polyurethane glue means it's 100% natural. It can go into the waste stream. It can be reground and turned into other things. And absolutely, we're most proud of that. It's only been in the market for about 3 years, predominantly in Europe and only in the US at a limited level. And then Vintop. So Vintop is a new venture for us. So we're 3.5 years into it, but today we are in Europe, probably the second largest screw cap manufacturer distributor in Europe. So we have 2 plants in Italy and 1 plant in Germany. And in the US, we have capacity of about 120 to 150 million screw caps today. And then lastly, wine quality solutions. So this is where I kind of fall into play as more than just a director of sales, is this understanding of wine quality. So when taking my organic chemistry at UC Davis, it was really interesting to really take a deep dive in phenolics and constructions of wine and all of the technical aspects of making wine. But we simplify that. So we have algorithms that are built into a lot of these tools that eliminate the need to have graduated cum laude in organic chemistry, and really allow you to just look at the data with a fresh set of eyes and see its in simplistic form, and make decisions based on what you see in wine quality. So we can talk about that a little bit. Overall, the assumptions around Vinventions is that we're more than a closure company, because we do have expertise in talking about wine maturation, wine making, aging, the closure choice, and then also bottling. So as we talk about the phenolic controls and so forth, and oxygen and the importance of oxygen, we have devices that really allow you to validate what it is you're trying to do and how you do it. So let's my mouse froze. So let's talk about what shelf life management is. So an approach to managing shelf life, you have to have a clear understanding of really 4 components. You have to understand what the polyphenol content and the oxidative capacity is of your wine at the beginning stages of your wine. So even pre-fermentation, the measurement of the phenolic content is imperative, and the oxidative capacity of that wine is imperative, because then you know through the bottling process and the maturation process what adjustments you can make to the wine itself. And then there's the oxygen management on the bottling line. So this is understanding the relationship of oxygen in the cap for the storage, understanding how areas where you might pick up oxygen or DO. DO, remember, free SO2 is what's protecting your wine, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But if anywhere in the process you're picking up dissolved oxygen along the way, that dissolved oxygen is going to consume free SO2 down the road and certainly affect your shelf life. Then there's TPO. So TPO is total package oxygen, and total package oxygen is not just the DO in the wine itself, but also the headspace, the amount of air or oxygen percentages that are sitting in the headspace, and then the relationship to the closure, the oxygen transfer rate, the sealing capacity, and really being able to have some sort of prediction of what the maturation is going to happen inside the bottle itself. And that leads to the last thing, and that is closure permeability. So it doesn't matter if you put a screw cap on it or you put a traditional finished closure in it, there is some form of permeability. The Sarinix liner, the Sara 10 liners still have permeability to them. So there's a misconception that wine closures are in fact, or screw caps are actually sealing the bottle. It's just not the case. Those liners do have intention of having a certain amount of oxygen control. What you do have is you have a bigger cavity and potential for oxygen at the beginning of bottling. I see we've lost a couple of people. Some of the attendees are like, "Oh, I don't want to. This is too technical. I don't want to stay." All right. So then, knowing that, you have to ask yourself a question. It's like, okay, how are you currently buying your closures? What's the criteria? Is it the aesthetics because your wine club says it has to be a certain way? Is it the price because your price points for your wine are $12 to $25 or $25 to $58? Is permeability performance a key question? And then lastly, sustainability. All of these things become effectively important as it relates to Nomocork, but if you only had to choose one, which one would it be? And that's an interesting question for the group, and I'd love to see your response in the chat field. I'm going to move on, but I'll look for that as you guys respond. All right, so let's talk about what oxygen ingress is. So again, as in a traditional inserted closure, oxygen ingress is really a pretty simple equation. So you see studies done on OTR, oxygen transfer rate, but it doesn't really complete the scenario. It doesn't really equate to a formula that we can predict shelf life from. So what we need is to understand the desorption value of the cork, and that's squeezing it in, whatever gets squeezed into the bottle at the point of bottling, released in the bottling, either short-term or long-term, and then the headspace that's sitting there below the cork, and then those two things, the OTR value and the desorption value, is oxygen ingress. So that is a combination of things. The environmental conditions really affect that pretty greatly, and I think it's logical in its most basic sense. Is if you take a bottle and you bottle it at 60 degrees and you set it in a room that's 80 degrees, the temperature of the wine, and it's changing, it's trying to match the outside environment, right? Because it's sitting in glass. So as it's trying to match the outside environment, it's affecting the pressure that is going in and out of the closure itself. So if you are taking the bottle from 60 to 80 to 60 to 80, you're constantly affecting the amount of pressure. It's a matter of physics of the bottle itself. So these things, your desorption value and OTRs is greatly affected by those environmental shifts that you come across. An example of that is really kind of how, as I'm describing it, how the closure and interseal closure kind of behaves. If you look at the initial state of a closure, is that you've got an atmosphere, the cork is sitting inside an atmospheric area that's normally about 21-22% oxygen. So if a closure is sitting in that environment, or it's bagged in CO2 or it's bagged in nitrogen, a Nomocork, for example, is bagged in nitrogen in most cases, or it's bagged in CO2. So the atmosphere that closure is sitting in is actually absent of air when it's going into a closure. But a natural cork is not bagged in a sealed bag that is based in CO2 or SO2 or even nitrogen. So a lot of times you're getting an atmosphere that's equivalent to what the air is. So you squeeze a portion of that right into the headspace as you squeeze it and put it into the bottle. And then you have oxygen transfer rate is the state of that rate at which oxygen from the outside pressure can go into the bottle. Difficult to completely explain it without having a bottle in front of you to compare it by, or to have a study. But ultimately, there is a transfer from inside to outside. And I think, if you have any questions about that, just let me know. All right. So when you look at the oxygen ingress curve over time, again, there are two stages. You have the oxygen transfer rate, which is really what we're looking at long-term for every closure. And that's not what's happening initially during the bottling phase. It is time, it's over time. So when you see descriptions of a closure, it's a 5-year wine or a 5-year closure, or it's a 10-year closure, or it's a 2-year closure, those things really are alluding to the fact that there's going to be a high OTR or low OTR, but it's not really a complete equation, because your wine still has DO, your wine still has free SO2. And those are very important elements to consider when you're really looking at the overall ingress curve and overall shelf life of the wine itself. So an example of that, so the desorption is the amount of oxygen that gets introduced to your wine at the point of bottling. So if you couple that with time, with your time of the OTR and the desorption value of the cork initially when it's being inserted into the bottle, you get an equation that essentially gives you your oxygen ingress curve over time. And if we look at that, if we compare that to like a Noma cork, for example, this is the green line. So this is the Noma cork green line. There's the Select Green 100, which is the lightest color band at the very bottom. There's the Select Green 300, and then the Select Green 500. So the initial desorption value in the first half of a year at the point of bottling, you can see how the two of those closures rise pretty quickly at the beginning, because they are not bagged in nitrogen like the Select 100 is. So the Select 100 has zero desorption at the beginning because you're squeezing nitrogen into the bottle. And so it really only has the OTR range that goes out over the course of, this is a chart here showing 5 years. If you notice, the 300 and the 500 almost run in parallel in OTR, but not through the desorption. So if you have a wine, I'll give you an example of how that can affect something. If you've got a Sauvignon Blanc or a Riesling where you don't really want to introduce any oxygen at all at the beginning because your DO value is nice and tight and really low, you want to keep it that low, we're going to put a Select 100 in it. But if you do have a Riesling that loves just a trace amount of oxygen at the point of bottling so that it's going right to the consumer and you don't want it to be tight, then you might consider putting a 300, which still has a really great long range shelf life plan for that wine, but it gives you just a little better sweet spot for how that wine's going to interact with a trace amount of oxygen at the point of bottling. And then if you've got a bigger wine, a big bolder wine, the Select 500 is really mirroring or is demonstrating what is an average of a natural cork. And I say average, and I'll show you a graph later, is because as you batch corks, they're not all the same. And I think you've all figured that out by now. These our closures are really talking about a rifle shot approach to oxygen management. So as a winemaker, you're saying, okay, when am I going to be pouring that wine to the consumer? From the point of bottling to the point of when they're going to be tasting it, how do I want that wine to appear? Do I want it to be tight and have them decant it, or do I want it to be a little more open? Or I want it to be just this flowery, beautiful thing at 6 months, because that's when I direct ship and everybody drinks my wine right away. So those are considerations that you have to take as a winemaker. Here's a better example of, here's a 5-year wine, and it talks about some variability and some other closures. So if you notice that on the left side is really the rifle shot of consistency. So you've got your Select Green corks, you've got your Reservas, but then you also have your liners for screw caps. So you have liners that give you a good example of having some controls as to the amount of oxygen that are going into the wines. And Suber is one of our corks. It's the micro natural that I was telling you about. And then you have some variation over here to the right. So even with natural grades, even very first natural grades, you get some range. And it's not saying that your wine is going to be bad. It's just saying that your wine is going to be inconsistent. So if you're pouring, if you grab case number 18 off the bottling line and you put it up on a shelf, and then you grab case number 200, you want them to taste the same, right? I mean, the goal is for them to taste the same, but the odds are there are going to be some slight variations. So if you grab a bottle from each and you create tasting notes, and your sales rep goes out in the field, you want those tasting notes to be as accurate as possible, and you want your consumer experience to be consistent. if they love your wine, great. And the next bottle they buy is going to be the same wine, the next one after that, the next one after that, next one after that. And so variability is what we're trying to eliminate, variability and consistency from across the board. I hope that this chart is a great representation of that. So how does that affect wine evolution? So this gets a little bit into the Nick Nordy details of wine oxygen management. So you have your polyphenols and oxygen. They create a chain reaction in the bottle. And that chain reaction ultimately decreases the amount of SO2 protection that you have in the wine. So that can modify your structure, it can modify aromas, it can modify color, and it can impact your shelf life. So having a clear and concise understanding for how much oxygen and what is predictable and what is not can put that chain reaction in your hands, in your control. And I think as winemakers, that's the most appealing part of it is we're not done when the wine goes into the bottle, and we shouldn't be. We should be concerned about how it goes all the way into the glass. So what does that mean exactly? So less oxygen, do you want it to be more reductive? Do you want it to be more amber? Do you want it to be more, I make a carbonic macerated Merlot. So that wine doesn't have the big, dark, chewy looking body that a typical Merlot would have. It actually has a fairly light garnet color. It looks more like a Pinot Noir in the glass than it does a Merlot. However, the acid content is high and the alcohol content is low. So that wine is very susceptible to oxidative characteristics. If I'm not careful, it can change that wine from, it's like a Grenache. You can change that wine from having that hint of purple to maybe a little bit of brown fringe, things of that nature. So I definitely control that cork. I control that wine with a Reserva just to make sure that that wine doesn't change color on me at all and doesn't fluctuate. It can also change how the profile tastes, right? It can either be on the borderline of fresh fruit, or it can move to cinnamon and sugar as it gets to the red wines, or you can really have that citrusy all the way to a standard fruit, an apricot or a peach or an apple, or even a more oxidized wine can really be right around those Turkish apricots, which is kind of scary. But ultimately, that chart on the right, again, is consumed oxygen and the SO2 over years. So that is where you definitely have to be careful, is that your wine and phenolic content is going to be affected by the decrease of SO2 over time based on the amount of oxygen consumed. So again, oxygen management is really monitoring the wine evolution. It's understanding, it's adapting your wine to what your perceived sweet spot is. You're not penalized when you buy corks from Waterloo in the Select Green line. You can choose a Select Green 100, 300, or 500. There's no financial penalty. It is an opportunity, if nothing else, for you to evaluate how you want your wine to be presented and what you need to do next to be able to present your best foot forward for your customer. So you have either low OTR values or ingress levels, or to moderate, which is still, again, an average of what a natural cork is. So it really depends on your style and the intended shelf life for those wines. Here's another example of a very sensitive rosé. And here's an example of, and it's 80% Mourvedre, Grenache, and Cinsault. And keep in mind, when you put those three elements together, we all know that Grenache and Mourvedre are very susceptible to browning and ambering up if you expose it to too much oxygen. So, a Grenache in particular is really, even at 10%, can be very scary with a little bit of after fermentation oxidation. And we're really not talking about pre-oxidizing wines at the beginning here, although that's an important consideration when making these types of wines. You can pre-ox them before they go through fermentation. But anyway, if you've got a completed rosé, Select Green 100, 300, and 500, you can see the amount of ingress, the parts per million, and the amount of remaining free SO2 over the course of 6 months after bottling. So you can see the decrease at almost 4 ppm. That's not severe, but it's different, right? So those wines, certainly after 6 months to a year, these, south of France wines are going to be probably very beautiful, but very different. I would actually love to have been able to taste these. So here was the review of the French Wine Institute and how they reviewed these wines and what they thought of them. So they characterized them. You can see the gray spot in the middle is the Select Green 100. It's kind of in that sweet spot of that wine. It's really on the lowest side, on the most tight, if you will, relative to citrusy. But as you open the wine up, they all still are within range of the oxidation, but the phenolic characteristics or the flavor profile changes pretty dramatically. So you have, again, the apricot on one side and you have the lime on the other. So you have those green apples. Now, if I'm a winemaker for this particular wine, I'm probably most interested in keeping around the pear and the kiwi style to this particular rosé, because I don't want it doesn't have any residual sugar, so I don't want it to be in the apricot range. I'm going to really, if I had to pick a sweet spot, I'd say I'd probably go with the Select Green line on this. And I would argue that it probably has to do with the Senso and the Grenache more so than the Mourvedre in this particular case. So what's the best solution for sensitive wine? So I get this question a lot. So if you look at, in Oregon, there's a winery called Kinwright Cellars, and Kinwright Cellars bottles and sells 7 different vineyard designated Pinot Noirs. Now they're all Pinots, and they're all fantastic, but they all have individual characteristics of these vineyards. And you're like, that's baloney. That doesn't really happen. No, it really does happen. The characteristics of those different vineyards can change year in and year out, which is kind of exciting as a winemaker. So there's nothing necessarily predictable from one vintage to the other, but their characteristics are so distinctive that that they have to maintain them in order to have the concept of a vineyard designated wine. And I'll give you an example. So one vineyard actually has a beautiful rose petal felt kind of aroma that shows up. And if you've ever, I'm a geek, right? So I take rose petals and I roll them in my hands and I smell that. That's a beautiful aroma. It's not necessarily the same rose that you get, when you hand to your spouse and for Valentine's Day or whatever. It's a different kind of thing when you roll it in your hands and you have it and you smell it that way. But one vineyard has that versus another one that might have more characteristics that come from the stemminess of the grapes themselves. And then another might have more of a bark aroma that's coming a more woody type aroma, or pepper or white pepper. So all those characteristics are invaluable when it comes to protecting those. And what we have that does the best job in really managing sensitive wines is this Reserva. So the Reserva line is even tighter than the Select series. So here you see the Reserva. It's the bottom line in this chart. It's the very, very bottom line. So long term, there's no oxygen ingress in the beginning, and its OTR level is even more refined than the Select 100. So the previous chart that I showed you had Select 500, 300, 100. The Reserva is the very last line here across the bottom. So that's an example of a closure that is really for those ultra sensitives, those Pinot Noirs, those Rieslings, those wines that have just those aromatics that you just absolutely want to protect and not lose over the course of time. Again, so here's the example here. You can see the Reserva is the bottom left-hand corner, right? And it's still, all these closures are still within a range. They all still have a targeted approach to them. But for this particular one, it really tightened up. You can see that it's now still inside citrusy, inside the Select 100. For me, I'm probably still preferring the 300 because I still kind of like that middle band. But the Reserva is definitely there to protect the wines. Here's another example, sensitive to oxidation, the Reserva, sensitive to reduction, you got 300 and 500, and then Slickering 100, 300, and then resistant to oxidation in bigger, bolder red wines. This gives you an idea of the potential there for the years in storage. I always hesitate when I put this on because it's all dependent on the characteristics of your grapes and the phenolic content, the SO2 level that you love at bottling, your pH level. There's just so many characters go into this, but we have to, from a marketing standpoint, you got to put a slide up and go, okay, what is it truly going to look like? It really is dependent on your winemaking skills, but this is a pretty good guide. All right, so in conclusion, oxygen ingress must be controlled and consistent. So this is really understanding the closure and how it goes into the bottle. Closures must be adapted to the wine for your desired shelf life. Again, it's evaluating your own shelf life and what your expectations for that wine and when you want it to be poured. Reserva offers the most controllable all the way through long-term aging. And then, of course, don't forget to bottle or manage your O2 at the point of bottling. So managing our O2 at the point of bottling is essential, and that is clearly understanding that how you're dosing, how controlled you are. One of the tools we have tomorrow, for example, I'm going to be at Hannah Winery in Sonoma. They are concerned that their screw cap line is, even though they've got a doser going into the cap, at the speed at which they run their line, they're concerned that their doser is not really doing what it's supposed to be doing. So I'm taking one of our tools. It's got a piercing device, and it literally goes down in through the screw cap into the headspace, and it measures the amount of oxygen that's in the headspace. And it's kind of like a quick audit to see if the mobile bottling line is working effectively or not. And I think that's it. I think that's it for me. I'm looking forward. I don't see any questions in the chat. Does anybody else see anything in the moment? I'm just going to close this screen and just put my mug up there only. And are there any questions? No hands raised, no questions, no chat. Oh, you're experts? Go get it. How can I help? My phone number is at the bottom of the presentation that we have, and I'm always available. So I'm here in Napa. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any follow-up. What do you think, New York Wine? You're on mute.
I wish I had $1 for every time. Someone said that to me.
Isn't that right?
Hearing all this. Well, thanks so much. We're, like I said, we're definitely going to send out the, hopefully, Don, will we be able to get a copy of the presentation so I can send that out to folks?
Yeah, for sure. Yep.
Great.
And and I wanted to show you. So this is an example of a bag of corks. This is a bag full of nitrogen, right? So if you get corks and it looks like this, that means it's being protected by nitrogen for that ingress value. So anyway, yeah, I'll send you and Georgia a copy of the presentation. That'd be great.
Great. And Todd Ickes actually just put a question in. Can you speak a bit more about OTR with screw caps?
Yeah, absolutely. I think OTR is underestimated in screw caps. There's a lot of things that have to go right in bottling screw caps. So you have the two different liners. Well, you have more liners than that, really, but really there's two that get sold on a regular basis. The Sarinix, which is the laminated one, the theoretically the tightest seal that you can get in a screw cap, and then there's Sarinix, and there's several other that the spirits industry uses, but really those two in our industry are the most similar. So when you have a screw cap, I just happen to have one in my hand. When you apply the cap on the top of the bottle, that down pressure and side pressure from the screw cap, from all those little horns as they come in, everything has to work perfectly to create a good seal on the top of the bottle. So your glass selection becomes imperative. So the ridge at the very topmost part of the glass has to have at least a reasonable surface area of 1 to 2 millimeters, so that when the cap gets pushed down, it has a flat surface to add pressure to it, if that makes sense. So because you're putting anywhere from 12 to 15 pounds of pressure at the point of torquing it down, and you want it to maintain. But if there's a sharpness to the glass, or if it's irregular in that it's not perpendicular or flat, those are things that can really dramatically affect the success of your oxygen transfer rate. When you're bottling it, you want to use if you have a mobile bottling line or your own screw cap line, you want to dose the cap as it's going in on top of the bottle. So you've got probably a nitrogen drip in the glass itself, and so you've got your wine fill height, and it's expressing oxygen. Then you're dosing in the cap, so that when you put the cap over the top of the bottle and you get the downward seal, you have little amount of oxygen that's in there as possible. The Sarinix liner, which is the most common liner, is very similar to our Select Green 100 cork. Yeah, so it's most similar, and just slightly under the 100 is the Sarah 10 liner. So if you have a screw cap and you want to put a traditional finish closure in, but you're concerned about OTR, then those, your Reserva, your Select Green 100s are going to be the most satisfying, I think, as it relates to an inserted closure. Did I answer your question well enough? I hope so. Cool. You owe me $1. You're on mute again.
There it is. Great. Well, George, did you have any follow-up that you wanted to just end with?
Frankly, we source on a regular basis, fresh stock from Vinventions. So what's here in the warehouse in all those formats that Don went through in the presentation are available on the floor for purchase. If there's somebody that wants to, you're used to using a natural cork or a Diam Aglo cork, and you want to test something out, just let me, reach out, call, and, we're happy to, give you a bag and let you, try something side by side. If for some reason you do want to migrate to a screw cap closure and try that as well. So we provide the technologies here at Waterloo Container so you can make those, winery level experiments and find out what works for yourself. And so, again, we're here to help. At the end of the day, we have access to experts like Don. So if something's not going perfectly well for you, we have access to answers, or at least to guidance. Sometimes the answers aren't what you want to hear. Maybe it has to do with the application itself, whatever that might be. But the goal is to have something come in and get back to you as quickly as we possibly can. And then the goal as a distributor is to have on the floor what you need when you need it. So when you're ready to bottle, everything's there, ready to go.